for the message today comes from the book of Philippians. We've been studying that in our morning Bible study. And this morning we're going to read Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. And the title of the message today is "For Me to Live is Christ." Now remember, Paul was in prison when he wrote this letter. And he begins in verse 12 by saying, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest, that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Some names are synonymous with one thing. You hear the name and you immediately think of something. If I say Michael Jordan, if you're a basketball fan, you think of basketball. If I say Babe Ruth, you think of baseball. Mozart, you think of music. Einstein, you think of genius. What do you think of when I say the name Paul? When I say the name Paul, I think of Jesus when I hear his name. In the 13 letters of Paul that are in the New Testament, 168 times he describes himself as being in Christ. To the best of my knowledge, no one ever spoke that way before. You never read, for example, in ancient literature, somebody writing about, "I am in Caesar, I am in Plato." It's a phrase that Paul made up to describe his total union with Jesus Christ. Paul had one agenda in life, and that was to live for Jesus Christ. And so no matter where he was, no matter what his circumstances were, his objective was the same: for me to live is Christ. What I want to show you from the text this morning is how, when you can say that and mean it, "For me to live is Christ," how it will transform your life. Look at the first thing. It's in verses 12 through 14. When you can say, "For me to live is Christ," it transforms difficult circumstances. Paul mentions in verse 12 the things that have happened to me. And he's talking, of course, about his imprisonment. Now, Paul had dreams, he had goals, he had what we would call aspirations, things that he hoped for. What he hoped for was, after he collected an offering for the poor in Jerusalem, he hoped to be able to go on to Spain, where he was going to start a new church, take the gospel for the very first time into Spain. That was his aspiration. His situation was that he was in prison. His situation was incarceration. Now, Acts 27 tells us how Paul got there. He had been arrested in Jerusalem. On the way to Rome, Paul had appealed, as any Roman citizen could do, he had appealed to Caesar, to have a hearing before Caesar. And so he was being taken to Rome to appear before Caesar, and he was shipwrecked there on the island of Malta. And he ended up being taken to Rome in chains. His aspirations, what he hoped for, and his situation were 180 degrees apart. And I'm probably speaking to someone who feels that way right now about your life. What you hoped for in life hasn't come to pass. It may be in your job, but maybe in a relationship. What you hoped for in life and what you have in life are two different things. Look at what Paul says in verse 12. What has happened to me has been for the furtherance or the advancement of the gospel. And you can hear the excitement in Paul's voice. That word that is translated, I believe it's furtherance in the King James, it's advance. In my translation, the English Standard Version here, it's an interesting word in the original language. Have you ever seen one of these jungle movies, you know, or a documentary about people traveling in the jungle, and there's one fellow out there in front with a machete, and he's chopping down the jungle, clearing a path so the people in back of him can follow? That's what this word means. Paul said, my imprisonment is like that. I'm out there hacking a path for the gospel. That's how he saw his imprisonment. And then he says in verse 13, it has become evident to the whole imperial guard, or the King James says the Praetorian guard, that I am wearing these chains for Christ. Now these palace guards who guarded the Caesar, they were the secret service of their day. They guarded the Caesar, they guarded his family. These were important people. They traveled in a realm that most Christians would never know anybody from that realm. Because of his imprisonment, not only did Paul get to know these men and get to talk to them, he was actually chained to one of them. And you better believe that Paul talked that man's ear off every day about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so he said, because of my chains, people know that I am wearing them for Jesus Christ. Do you see how Paul took what otherwise would have been a disappointment and turned it into something positive? Because for Paul to live was Christ. You see, Paul knew that God was in control of his life. And because Paul knew that, it colored the way he saw everything. Paul knew that even when he couldn't see the end, God could. I play chess. I've played off and on for about 40 years. I'm not a great player. I'm an average player. I love to play. I read once that a normal or average chess player can see 3 moves in advance. In other words, if I move my pawn here, he'll probably move his pawn there. Then I'll move my knight here, he'll probably move there. I'll move my bishop here. He'll do 3 moves in advance. That's a normal player. A chess master, I've read, can see 30 moves in advance. In other words, they basically, at the beginning of a game, when they make their move, they see how the game is likely to unfold. 30 moves in advance. Now, if a chess master can see 30 moves in advance, how many moves in advance do you think God can see? How far in advance can God see? See, what often looks like a disappointment to us is in fact something that God is using to bring about something good, something Christ-like, something that will bless Christians and bring the lost to faith. We can't see it because we're like that average chess player who can only see 3 moves in advance, but God sees all the way to the end. My favorite devotional book was written by a man named Oswald Chambers. The name of the book is My Utmost for His Highest. Oswald Chambers was a British minister. And when World War I broke out, he volunteered to serve as a chaplain, a YMCA chaplain. The military didn't have full-time chaplains. Then he went with the YMCA, and the YMCA sent the men to wherever they were needed. And so Chambers and his wife Gertrude, they were sent to Egypt. And Chambers' job was to minister to the British soldiers who were stationed there in Egypt. He met every night with the British soldiers, taking his Bible and trying to encourage them from the Word. Because his wife Gertrude was there, because she was a court reporter, she took shorthand at the rate of 200 words per minute. She wrote down everything he said to those young soldiers, in many cases teenage boys, who were going off to war or who had come back from being injured. She wrote down everything he said. While he was there, he was struck with a ruptured appendix. Needed surgery. But he refused the operation because he said he refused to take the bed of a soldier who had been injured in battle. And he died from that ruptured appendix at the age of 43. His wife, Gertrude, and their young baby went back home to England. And she lived with family for a while until she got back on her feet, and she started running a boarding house. I guess it was just a big house that she turned into a boarding house. It had 8 rooms, and that's how she made her living. And every morning after she got those boarders off to work, fed them breakfast and got them off to work, she went down into the basement of that big old house, and there with a manual typewriter began typing out the words that her husband had spoken, that she had written in shorthand there in the Egyptian desert in the shadow of the pyramids. The book was published, and that's the book, My Utmost for His Highest. It has blessed countless millions of Christians since its publication. See, what looked like a disaster was something that God was using for His purpose. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, God can take the most difficult circumstances of your life and transform them. And the second thing is in verses 15 through 18. When you can say, for me to live in Christ, it can change impossible relationships. Now, when I say that, you may have someone who immediately pops into your mind. Maybe a coworker, maybe a neighbor, maybe somebody in your own house. You know, the book of Proverbs says it is better to dwell on a rooftop than to live in a house of contention. Sounds like he'd been there. Sounds like he knew that from experience. Paul writes in verse 15 that some were preaching Christ out of envy and strife and selfish ambition while Paul was in jail. Evidently, these Christian preachers, some of them were defaming Paul while he was in prison, jealous of Paul and using it as an opportunity to belittle him or run him down. You know, not everyone who serves the Lord does so out of a pure motive. And that was the case with some of those in Paul's day. But look at what he says in verse 18. It's translated, what then? It would be sort of like saying, so what? You know, who cares? As long as the gospel is being preached, he says, and in that I rejoice. When you can write, for me to live is Christ over every relationship in your life will be measured by that reality. You know, when you wear your feelings on your sleeve and take to heart every unkind word that's said about you, every slight, you're going to be miserable in life. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, you know, so-and-so doesn't like me, as if that's the first time that has ever happened. Welcome to life. Welcome to reality. That's life. But when you can write over that relationship that has become a hindrance to you, a thorn to you, for me to live is Christ, it will transform that relationship. I was reading about a pastor from my home state of Louisiana, Dr. Harry Blake, who's pastor for almost 50 years now of the Mount Canaan Baptist Church in Shreveport, Louisiana. Dr. Blake is a black man. And in 1963, after that awful bombing of the 56th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Blake and some other black ministers from there in Shreveport, they went to see the chief of police in Shreveport to ask if they could have a peaceful march there in Shreveport in honor, in memoriam of those 4 little girls who were killed in what was one of the darkest days in American history. The chief of police didn't give him an answer that day. But a few days later, he showed up with some other men, 9 other men. They are at Dr. Blake's church. And they dragged that pastor out of his office, took him outside, and beat him to a pulp. There was no march in honor of those girls. Dr. Blake was hospitalized. It took 40 years for the city of Shreveport to formally apologize for that. But when that racist chief of police lay dying in bed, guess who he asked for to come to visit him in his sick bed and to pray for him? Dr. Harry Blake. Now would you go? A man who had dragged you out of your office and beat you to a pulp for no other reason than just hatred? You know what Dr. Blake did? He went. And he stood there at that man's bedside and prayed for him. How could he do that? There's only one way. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, you can do that. There may be someone right now who is like that for you. What I want you to do is take that relationship to God. Take it to a higher atmosphere. I was reading about transatlantic flights. You know, Charles Lindbergh is the name that's always associated with that. He was the first to do a solo transatlantic flight. He was not the first one to attempt transatlantic flight. Others had tried before, and they always encountered problems. One particular pilot I was reading about, as he was flying his plane over the Atlantic, he started hearing a funny noise and noticed that his instrument, the electric instruments, it's like they were shorting out. Now, this was a solo transatlantic flight. So he couldn't tell the co-pilot, take the controls here while I check out what's underneath the instrument panel there. And then he looked down and noticed that little pieces of cloth, back then electrical wires were covered with cloth. Notice little pieces of cloth were dropping down onto the floor of the airplane, and he figured out what it was. There was a rat underneath in the control panel, and that rat was gnawing on the cloth covering the electrical wires. Now, if that rat gnawed through one of the wires, that plane was going to crash. So you know what the pilot did? He started going up. And he took that airplane up into a higher atmosphere where the rat couldn't live. And eventually, the rat died. And it fell down onto the floor of the plane. That relationship that's gnawing at you, you take it to a higher atmosphere where that rat that's in your heart falls out. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, it will transform your relationships. And here's the last thing. It's in verses 20 and 21. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, it will help you to face future uncertainties. You'd have to have your head in the sand to not realize that we are living in difficult times. The world is in upheaval. Our economy is in trouble. I was reading recently the Federal Reserve is saying it may be the year 2014 before the economy stabilizes. The European economy is even in worse shape. The threat of bankruptcy looms in many of those nations. The Middle East is in an uproar. Iran is inching closer every day to having nuclear weapons. The same with North Korea, two of the most unstable countries in the world. can tell you, I have the gift of prophecy. I'm going to tell you what's going to be in the newspaper tomorrow. You ready to hear it? Someone is going to die. There'll be a fire. There'll be a war or a rumor of war. That's the time we live in. And that's just the big picture. That's not even talking about your life, your home, your job, your relationship. A buddy of mine was telling me he got up one morning and was reading the newspaper, and it got him so depressed he set it down and he turned on the TV and tried to watch the news. He was watching the Today Show. Just as he turned it on, they were having a special segment about mosquitoes and the West Nile virus and what a problem that was becoming, especially here in California. And so he turned the TV off and decided to go for a walk. And he got about a block away from his house and a mosquito landed on his arm. And he thought, oh no, I got the West Nile virus. Look at what Paul says in verse 20. Whether by life or by death. Now, Paul was in jail when he wrote that, awaiting trial under the most unstable man to ever rule over Rome, Nero. There's a reason that people name their sons Paul and their dogs Nero. Nero was crazy. How do we face a life filled with uncertainties? Well, how did Paul face his uncertain future? Because he had no way of knowing if Nero was going to spare his life or execute him. Well, look at what he says in verse 22. If I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit for my labor. What Paul means is this. If I get out of here, fine. I'm going to take the gospel over to Spain. I'll be the first one to take the gospel there. And that'll be just fine by me. On the other hand, if they execute me, I'll go to be with the Lord. And that'll be fine with me too. Look at what he says in verse 23. He says, I'm hard-pressed between the two. He honestly didn't know which one he preferred. And he uses that word, depart there. He says, I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart. And that word that is translated there, depart, it was a word that was used when a ship would come to dock, into port, and a rope would be used to tie it there to the dock to secure it. And the word depart was the word that was used for when those ropes were unloosed so that the ship could sail out to sea. Paul was saying, if it's time for me to let loose those ropes that hold me here to this life so that I can sail out into the sea of eternity, that's fine by me. You know when you can say that? When you can say, for me to live is Christ. I remember studying Hamlet in school. Hamlet contains the most famous single line that William Shakespeare ever wrote, to be or not to be. Now, when Hamlet utters those words, he's in a dilemma. His father, the king, had just been murdered. And his mom waited all of 2 months to remarry. And by the way, she marries his dead dad's brother. And the ghost of Hamlet's father visits him, tells him what happened, and wants Hamlet to avenge him. But Hamlet has this quandary, you know, if he takes vengeance on his father's life, he'll leave his mom a widow again, and possibly face retribution himself. He may be killed. Or he can take his own life. That's a possibility, but he's afraid of what awaits him if he dies. He's afraid of the uncertainty, the unknown about death. And so when he says to be or not to be, what he's saying is, I don't know if it's better to live or die. Both of them are bad. Paul says just the opposite. If I live on, great. I'll keep serving the Lord. I'll take the gospel into Spain. The gospel will be preached. Christians will come, and people will come to know the Lord. Churches will be started. That's wonderful. And if not, if I go on to be executed, I'll be there with the Lord. Because Paul knew that to be absent from the body was to be present with the Lord. Now, what happened to Paul? Philippians doesn't tell us, but we can piece it together from 2 Timothy. We know that Paul had a trial before Nero, and Timothy was there with him. But then he faced a second trial, and he writes that no one stood with him there. Paul would eventually be beheaded by Nero. And I can picture what happened. I've seen photos of that prison. You can still visit it, I'm told, there in Rome. It was really more of a dungeon than a prison. The guard would have come in, and there's a giant brass grate that the guard would have lifted up to look down into that dungeon where the prisoners were. I believe this guard had converted. So when he came in that day to look for Paul, he would have called him Brother Paul. As he lifted up that grate and looked down into that vermin-infested dungeon and said, Brother Paul, I'm so sad with what I've come to tell you today. It's not good news. They're going to execute you. And Paul would have said, brother, it's all right. Because I've already told you, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And that brother Christian would have led Paul out to where the executioner waited with his axe. Would have asked Paul to lay his head there on a block of wood to stretch his neck out over it. And as the axeman raised up the axe and it came down for a brief instant, the light of the sun would have shone off the metal as it came to end Paul's life. And in the very next instant, it would have been the light of the Son of God that Paul saw. The one whose face shone brighter than the sun when Paul met him that first time on the road to Damascus so many years earlier. And there Paul finally would have been fully in the presence of the Lord, not seeing through a glass darkly any longer, but face to face with Jesus Christ. When you can say, for me to live is Christ, it will transform difficult circumstances. It will change impossible relationships, and it will help you to face future uncertainties. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 320, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. Let's stand.